The most iconic monument in America cost $989,992.32 to build. That's the exact figure. The government kept it down to the penny. 14 years of dynamite and jackhammers, 400 men dangling off a cliff face in leather harnesses, 450,000 tons of granite blasted into rubble at the bottom of a canyon, and the final bill came in under $1 million. Adjusted for inflation, the whole thing cost less than a mid-size hotel in Sioux Falls. And yet in 2024, for the first time in years, fewer than 2 million people bothered to show up. Nearly a quarter of the previous year's visitors simply didn't come. The most photographed mountain in the Western Hemisphere, and the crowds are thinning. To understand why, you have to understand what Mount Rushmore actually is. Not what it represents, not democracy, not patriotism, not the American spirit. What it is. Because from the very beginning, Mount Rushmore was not a monument. It was a business proposition, a marketing campaign carved in granite. And like all marketing campaigns, it has a shelf life. The whole thing started with a man named Doane Robinson. Robinson was the state historian of South Dakota, a former farmer and lawyer from Wisconsin who had reinvented himself as the keeper of South Dakota's past. By the early 1920s, Robinson had a problem. The Black Hills were beautiful, everyone agreed on that, but tourists were beginning to discover other beautiful places. The automobile was changing everything. A family that might have spent a week at a Black Hills lodge could now drive to Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon or Glacier. Robinson watched the numbers and didn't like what he saw. Tourists soon get fed up on scenery, he said, unless it has something of special interest connected with it to make it impressive. So Robinson hatched a plan. He would give them something they couldn't see anywhere else. He had been reading about the Confederate memorial under construction at Stone Mountain in Georgia, where a sculptor was carving enormous figures into a rock face, and the idea lodged in his mind. He imagined doing the same thing in the Black Hills, carving enormous figures into the granite spires known as the Needles, a series of dramatic pillars in what is now Custer State Park. His proposed subjects were heroes of the American West: Red Cloud, the Oglala Lakota chief; Lewis and Clark; Buffalo Bill Cody; maybe General Custer. A parade of frontier legends rising from the rock like misplaced gods. It was a wild idea, grandiose and slightly unhinged, and Robinson knew he needed someone equally grandiose to execute it. He first wrote to a Chicago sculptor named Laredo Taft, who was too ill to make the trip. Then, in September of 1924, Robinson wrote a letter to a man who had just been fired from the most controversial sculpture project in America. Gutzon Borglum was born in 1867 in what was then Idaho Territory, the son of Danish Mormon immigrants. His father had 2 wives, sisters, and when the family left the church and moved to Nebraska, Gutzon's birth mother was simply erased from the household, sent away while Gutzon was still a boy. Whether this shaped his personality is for biographers to debate, but the personality itself is not in dispute. Borglum was brilliant, vain, combative, and relentlessly ambitious. He studied sculpture in Paris under Auguste Rodin. He exhibited work for Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle. He carved a marble bust of Abraham Lincoln that now sits in the Capitol crypt. And by the time Robinson contacted him, Borglum was embroiled in a disaster of his own making at Stone Mountain, Georgia. The Stone Mountain project had been commissioned by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, a massive bas-relief of Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis, to be carved into the face of the largest exposed granite monolith east of the Mississippi. It was at Stone Mountain that Borglum became entangled with the Ku Klux Klan. The degree of his involvement has been debated for a century. He attended a Klan strategy meeting in Washington, D.C. in 1923. He corresponded at length with D.C. Stevenson, the infamous Grand Dragon of Indiana, who would later be convicted of rape and murder. A letter from Stevenson to Borglum, inscribed, "To my good friend Gutzon Borglum, with the greatest respect," is displayed to this day in the museum at Mount Rushmore. Borglum's own letters to Stevenson, according to the biographers Howard and Audrey Schaff, contained passages expressing what they described as a deep conviction in Nordic moral superiority. Whether Borglum was a true believer or merely a fundraiser courting donors, the Klan connection was real, and it followed him. By 1925, the Stone Mountain Project had collapsed. Infighting between Borglum and his sponsors, much of it entangled with factional wars within the Klan itself, led to his firing on February 25, 1925. Borglum took an axe to his plaster models rather than let them be used by another sculptor, and with a posse of angry locals pursuing him, fled Georgia for North Carolina. The Stone Mountain sponsors sandblasted his work off the mountain and hired someone else. Borglum was humiliated, broke, and looking for his next project. That's when Doane Robinson's letter arrived. Borglum came to South Dakota, and Robinson took him on a tour of the Needles. The sculptor was unimpressed. The granite spires were too thin, too fragile, too regional. Figures carved into those pillars, Borglum's son Lincoln later wrote, would look like misplaced totem poles. But as Borglum explored the Black Hills further, he found something better. A broad wall of southeast-facing granite on a 5,725-foot peak, bathed in morning sunlight for most of the day. The rock was dense, hard, and deep, ideal for carving on a monumental scale. And Borglum had a bigger vision than Robinson's frontier heroes. He wanted precedence. He wanted national significance. He wanted the kind of project that could never be taken away from him the way Stone Mountain had been. The mountain Borglum chose already had two names, and both of them tell the story of the place better than any documentary can. The newer name was Mount Rushmore, and it was barely 40 years old. In 1885, a New York lawyer named Charles Edward Rushmore had traveled to the Black Hills to inspect mining claims for an Eastern tin company. One afternoon, riding through the hills with a prospector named William Challis, Rushmore asked the name of a particularly imposing granite peak. Challis looked at him, looked at the mountain, and reportedly said, "It's never had one, till now. We'll call the damn thing Rushmore." The name stuck. In 1930, the United States Board on Geographic Names made it official. Charles Rushmore, pleased with the honor, later donated $5,000 to the carving of the mountain that bore his name. A New York mining lawyer, inspecting claims on land seized from the Sioux, names a mountain after himself on a whim. And a quarter-century later, someone carves the faces of 4 presidents into it. This is a story that could only happen in America, and it could only happen in the Black Hills. But the mountain had an older name, and it carried a different kind of weight. The Lakota Sioux called it Tunkasila Shakpe, the 6 grandfathers. It represented the 6 sacred directions of Lakota cosmology: north, south, east, west, sky, and earth. The mountain sat in the Black Hills, a region the Lakota called the heart of everything that is, not a poetic metaphor, but a precise statement of spiritual geography. The Black Hills were where the Lakota people understood themselves to have originated. Vision quests were conducted there. Medicinal plants were gathered. Ceremonies were held at sites throughout the range, including at the 6 grandfathers. In 1868, the United States government had signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which guaranteed the Black Hills and all land in western South Dakota to the Lakota and allied tribes in perpetuity. The treaty was explicit. No cession of any part of the reservation would be valid unless approved by 3/4 of the adult male population of the Sioux Nation. Perpetuity, it turned out, lasted about 6 years. In 1874, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills and confirmed the presence of gold. Within months, prospectors were pouring in. The government made a show of trying to stop them, then quietly ordered the Army to stand down. President Ulysses Grant himself, according to documents cited by the Supreme Court, privately decided that the military should make no further resistance to the occupation of the Black Hills by miners. What followed was the Great Sioux War of 1876, the conflict that included the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where Custer and much of the 7th Cavalry were killed. The Lakota and their allies won the battle, but lost the war. By 1877, Congress had unilaterally seized the Black Hills, violating the very treaty it had ratified 9 years earlier. The Act of 1877 required no vote of the Sioux. Their sacred mountains were simply taken. This is the land on which Gutzon Borglum proposed to carve the faces of 4 American presidents. The choice of which presidents was itself a kind of performance. Washington for the founding, Jefferson for the Louisiana Purchase, the deal that brought the land containing the Black Hills under American sovereignty, Lincoln for preserving the Union, and Theodore Roosevelt, reportedly suggested by President Calvin Coolidge, for the Panama Canal and America's emergence as a world power. Each of these men, as historians would later note, had also been involved in policies that dispossessed or harmed Native Americans. Washington and Jefferson owned enslaved people. Roosevelt, who was a personal friend of Borglum's, once declared that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, a phrase he used publicly. Lincoln, the day after signing the Emancipation Proclamation, authorized the largest mass execution in American history, the hanging of 38 Dakota men at Mankato, Minnesota. None of this was discussed at the dedication ceremony. On October 4th, 1927, President Coolidge himself traveled to the Black Hills to inaugurate the project. Borglum had dressed him in a cowboy hat and chaps for the occasion, a publicity stunt that generated national coverage. The sculptor raised his arm, the first drills whirred to life, and work began on the most ambitious sculpture in American history, a project funded initially by private donations, then increasingly by federal money, built during the worst economic depression the country had ever seen. The workers who carved Mount Rushmore were mostly local miners who knew how to handle dynamite and jackhammers. They earned $8 a day, decent wages during the Depression when many men in the region had no work at all. About 30 men worked at any given time, drawn from a rotating pool of roughly 400 over the life of the project. Each morning, they climbed 700 steps to the top of the mountain, punched a time clock, and were lowered down the cliff face in leather-seated harnesses called bosun chairs, suspended on steel cables 3/8 of an inch thick. The winches that lowered them were operated by hand. A man's life depended on another man's grip. Powder men calculated dynamite charges to remove precise amounts of rock, sometimes a ton, sometimes an ounce, and placed them in holes drilled to exact specifications using measurements Borglum transferred from a 12:1 scale model in his studio below. Call boys perched on narrow ledges where they could see both the carvers dangling on the cliff face and the winch operators on the summit above, barking instructions back and forth across the granite void. Blacksmiths at the base of the mountain forged and sharpened hundreds of drill bits each day, worn dull by the hardest stone on the continent. 90% of the sculpture was carved by explosives. The remaining detail work, the nostrils, the pupils, the thin line of Washington's lips, the delicate curvature of Jefferson's brow, was done by hand with pneumatic drills and chisels in conditions that one historian described as astonishing that no one was killed. Borglum had even devised a way to carve realistic-looking eyes. Workers left a small cube of granite in each pupil to catch the light, creating the illusion of a highlight. From a quarter-mile away, the eyes appear to follow you. It's an extraordinary trick of scale. And indeed, remarkably, over 14 years of construction, not a single worker died on the project. Many of them, though, would later develop a lung condition from years of breathing granite dust, a slow consequence that didn't show up on any accident report. The work lurched forward in fits and starts, always at the mercy of funding and weather. Winters shut everything down for months at a stretch. Congress appropriated money in pieces, never enough, and Borglum operated under what one historian called a field of dreams theory of financing. Start the work and the money will come. It often didn't. By 1929, the federal government had agreed to match private donations up to $250,000, roughly half the project's estimated cost. But the estimate was absurd. The Great Depression crushed private fundraising, and the project limped along on sporadic federal appropriations, with Borglum constantly traveling to Washington to lobby, charm, and bully senators into releasing more funds. He fought with everyone, with Robinson, who felt increasingly marginalized, with the National Park Service, which assumed administration of the site in 1933 and promptly clashed with the sculptor over authority, with Senator Peter Norbeck, who had championed the project in Washington but grew exasperated by Borglum's ego, and with anyone who questioned his artistic decisions. Borglum was so competitive that he and his son Lincoln reportedly hired young men for the Mount Rushmore work crew based partly on their baseball skills. The memorial fielded an amateur team that took second place in the 1939 South Dakota State Tournament. He had originally planned to carve the presidents from head to waist, not just their faces. He envisioned an enormous inscription on the mountain's eastern face called the entablature, shaped like the outline of the Louisiana Purchase, containing a brief history of the United States. He secretly began blasting a hall of records into the granite behind the heads, a vault intended to hold the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and other founding documents. When Congress discovered he was spending federal money on the hall instead of the faces, they ordered him to stop. He obeyed, but vowed to return to it. He never did. On March 6, 1941, Gutzon Borglum died in Chicago following complications from surgery. He was 73. His son Lincoln took over the project, but the money was gone, and the country was 8 months from entering World War II. On October 31, 1941, all work stopped. The sculpture was declared complete. 4 heads instead of 4 torsos, no entablature, no hall of records. The most ambitious version of Mount Rushmore existed only in a plaster model sitting in a studio at the base of the mountain. What visitors see today is, in a real sense, an unfinished monument. But as a tourist attraction, it worked exactly as Doane Robinson had hoped. The post-war highway boom brought Americans west in unprecedented numbers, and Mount Rushmore became one of the essential stops on the great American road trip. The town of Keystone, 2 miles from the memorial's entrance, had been a gold mining settlement since the 1880s, a rough collection of cabins and claims along Battle Creek, home to the Holy Terror mine, which was one of the richest small gold operations in the Black Hills. When the mines played out, Keystone nearly died. Mount Rushmore saved it. By the 1950s and 1960s, the town's 500 permanent residents were running motels, restaurants, and gift shops for the hundreds of thousands of visitors pouring through each summer. Families in station wagons pulled into gravel parking lots, bought postcards and buffalo-shaped restaurant menus, and ceramic plates with the 4 faces painted on them. The original visitor facilities were modest: a concession stand, a small gift shop, a viewing area. But the attraction wasn't the facilities, it was the mountain. Alfred Hitchcock filmed the climax of North by Northwest there in 1959, sending Cary Grant scrambling across the presidential foreheads, though most of the climbing scenes were actually shot on studio sets because the Park Service wouldn't allow actors on the actual monument. But the image stuck. The faces became shorthand for America itself, reproduced on stamps, in textbooks, on television, on currency, on T-shirts in airport gift shops from Miami to Anchorage. In 1937, Congress even considered adding a 5th face. A bill proposed carving Susan B. Anthony alongside the 4 presidents, but it died when a rider on the appropriations bill mandated that federal funds could only be spent on carvings already underway. The mountain stayed as it was. By the late 20th century, Mount Rushmore was drawing close to 3 million visitors a year, making it the single most visited site in South Dakota and one of the most recognizable landmarks on Earth. In 1998, the memorial completed a massive 10-year renovation. A new Gutzon Borglum Visitor Center was opened. A new amphitheater was built. The Avenue of Flags, a walkway lined with the flags of all 50 states, 5 territories, the District of Columbia, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, was redesigned. A handicapped accessible presidential walk trail brought visitors to within 500 feet of the sculpture. The total cost of the renovation was $56 million, all raised through donations and investments with no taxpayer money. $17 million of that went to building a parking structure, a multi-level garage operated not by the National Park Service, but by a private concessionaire. This detail would later become one of the most common complaints in visitor reviews. Because here is where the story turns. You drive for hours across the South Dakota plains. Beautiful country, but empty, relentlessly empty. The kind of landscape that makes you feel the distance in your bones. You pass through Rapid City, the nearest real town, population 75,000, about 30 minutes away. You wind through the Black Hills on 2-lane roads. Iron Mountain Road, if you take the scenic route, a spectacular feat of 1930s engineering with its pigtail bridges and 1-lane tunnels that frame the monument in the distance. You pass through Keystone, which by now bears almost no resemblance to the mining town it once was. The old rhythm is gone. Today, the town's 500 permanent residents are vastly outnumbered by the seasonal workers who staff the gift shops, the themed restaurants with names like the Grizzly Creek, the helicopter tour offices, the mini golf courses with mining themes, the wax museum, the alpine coasters, and the seemingly infinite supply of stores selling identical turquoise jewelry and saltwater taffy. Locals will tell you the old character of the place moved to the edges years ago. Keystone exists in its current form because of the monument. If you removed the 4 faces from the mountain, the town would evaporate within a season. Then you arrive at the memorial itself. You pull into the parking garage. You pay $10. Your National Parks Pass does not work here. The parking is a concession fee, not an entrance fee, and the garage is operated by Xanterra Parks and Resorts, a Colorado-based corporation that holds concession contracts at Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, Glacier, and Zion as well. You take an elevator or walk upstairs. You pass through the Avenue of Flags. You reach the viewing terrace. And there they are. 4 faces, 60 feet tall, a quarter-mile away. They are objectively impressive. The engineering alone is extraordinary. But the experience of standing there and looking at them is, and this is the word that appears over and over again in visitor accounts, underwhelming. The sculpture is smaller than you expected. It's farther away than you expected. You have seen it so many times in photographs and films that the actual sight of it produces a strange flattening, a recognition without revelation. You take the photograph. You take another one with your family in the foreground. You walk the presidential trail, which winds through the pine forest below the faces. You visit the gift shop. You eat at the Carver's Marketplace, a food court redesigned in 2017 to emphasize fresh and regional foods. And then you get back in the car, because there is, in the honest assessment of many visitors, not much else to do. The whole visit takes 90 minutes. Maybe 2 hours if you watch the film in the visitor center. A man who visited in 2018 put it plainly in an online review. Every time they show Mount Rushmore on the TV, it looks huge. That's because they zoom in on it. When you see it in person, it's about a quarter-mile away from the viewing area, a big letdown. Another visitor, more blunt, "I don't know what I was expecting, but I was completely underwhelmed. It's exactly what you're expecting. Tall carvings of the faces of 4 presidents." This gap between expectation and experience has always existed, but it mattered less when Mount Rushmore had no competition for attention. For decades, the monument occupied a unique position in the American imagination, a spectacle so familiar that visiting it felt almost like a civic duty. You didn't go to be surprised. You went to confirm something you already knew about yourself and your country. But two forces have eroded that position, slowly and then all at once, and they explain why the parking garage is a little emptier each summer. The first is the story of the mountain itself. For most of the 20th century, the typical visitor to Mount Rushmore knew almost nothing about the Lakota, the Treaty of Fort Laramie, or the Six Grandfathers. The dedication ceremonies never mentioned Native Americans. The interpretive materials for decades said little or nothing about the land's prior significance. Visitors saw 4 presidents in granite and understood the monument as a straightforward celebration of American greatness. That is no longer the default understanding. The shift began in 1970 when a group of 23 Native American activists, led by the San Francisco-based United Native Americans, climbed 3,000 feet to the top of Mount Rushmore at dusk on August 29th and set up camp. They renamed the landmark Crazy Horse Mountain and demanded the federal government honor the 1868 treaty. The organizer was Lehman Brightman, a Sioux activist and history professor who later described it as the first Sioux uprising in South Dakota since the Lakota defeated Custer in 1876. Indian people from across the state brought supplies and food and participated in prayer vigils. The occupation lasted more than 2 months, ending only when severe winter weather forced the protesters off the mountain in November. 7 months later, on June 6, 1971, members of the American Indian Movement returned. At dawn, a group that included both men and women scaled the mountain, reached the top, and erected a ceremonial altar behind Theodore Roosevelt's head. One of them was Madonna Thunderhawk, an AIM leader whose 12-year-old daughter, Marcella Gilbert, would later recall watching the whole thing on television and thinking it was cool and also a little frightening. When Park Superintendent Wallace McCaw sent 50 rangers and deputies to the summit, the protesters refused to come down. "We won't leave," they said, "unless you honor the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty." After 12 hours, 20 protesters, 9 men and 11 women, were arrested, some of them carried bodily down the mountainside. When they cited the 1868 treaty in court, the federal judge, himself a landowner in the Black Hills, recused himself, and the charges were eventually dismissed. Then, in 1980, the United States Supreme Court delivered a ruling that would reverberate across every subsequent decade. In United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians, the court held 8-1 that the seizure of the Black Hills in 1877 was an unconstitutional taking of property. Justice Harry Blackmun, writing for the majority, called it a more ripe and rank case of dishonorable dealings than would likely ever again be found in American history. The court awarded the Sioux $17.1 million, the assessed value of the land in 1877, plus interest dating back over a century, for a total of roughly $105 million. The Sioux refused the money. They have refused it ever since. The funds sit in a trust account at the United States Treasury, accruing compound interest. By 2011, the balance had exceeded $1 billion. Current estimates place it well above $2 billion. The Lakota, among the poorest people in America, living on reservations with staggering rates of unemployment, addiction, and early death, have never collected a single dollar. Their position is that the land was never for sale. Accepting the money would legally extinguish their claim to the Black Hills. As a matter of principle, over more than 4 decades now, they have chosen poverty over settlement. It is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary acts of sustained political resistance in modern American history. This story, the stolen land, the broken treaty, the uncollected billions, was once known mainly to historians and activists. It is now common knowledge. It is taught in schools. It appears in travel guides. It is mentioned in virtually every recent article written about Mount Rushmore. When visitors stand on the viewing terrace today, Many of them know that the mountain they're looking at was carved into a site that the Supreme Court itself ruled was illegally taken. The four faces that once seemed to embody American ideals now, for a growing number of Americans, embody something more complicated. The second force is a monument 16 miles down the road. In 1939, 2 years before Mount Rushmore was declared complete, a Lakota elder named Henry Standing Bear wrote a letter to a sculptor named Korshak Ziolkowski. Ziolkowski had worked briefly on Mount Rushmore as an assistant to Borglum. 19 days, by most accounts, ending in a heated argument with Lincoln Borglum. Standing Bear's letter contained a single, devastating sentence. "My fellow chiefs and I would like the white man to know that the red man has great heroes, too." Ziolkowski accepted the commission. On June 3, 1948, he detonated the first blast on Thunderhead Mountain, a peak in the Black Hills about a 30-minute drive from Rushmore. The Crazy Horse Memorial, when completed, will depict the Oglala Lakota warrior on horseback, pointing toward the horizon, toward his people's land. The head of Crazy Horse alone is 87 feet tall, nearly half again the size of any face on Rushmore. The finished sculpture will be 563 feet tall and 641 feet long. It will be the largest mountain carving in the world. It may also never be finished. Ziolkowski worked on it until his death in 1982. His wife, Ruth, continued the work. Their children and grandchildren carry it on today. The memorial has never accepted a cent of federal or state funding. It is entirely supported by admissions and private donations. There is no set completion date. When visitors ask the family how long it will take, the answer has become a kind of dark joke. Korchak's grandson, Caleb Ziolkowski, has said that his grandfather compared the carving timeline to Mount Rushmore's 14 years, and pointed out that Crazy Horse, by that measure, is still the smallest part of the Foundation's mission. Over 1 million visitors now come to Crazy Horse each year. Many of them visit Mount Rushmore first, then drive south. And something happens during that drive. They go from a finished monument on stolen land, a monument that took 14 years and was declared done when the money ran out, to an unfinished monument on private land, built without government help, dedicated to the very people whose mountain was taken. The experience of Crazy Horse is, by most accounts, the opposite of Rushmore. Slower, more emotional, more layered. There is a museum of Native American art and artifacts. There are educational programs. There is the mountain itself, still being carved, visibly in progress, a testament to patience and defiance. Many visitors report that Crazy Horse is the more moving of the two. Some report that after seeing Crazy Horse, Mount Rushmore feels like something they no longer fully understand. The numbers tell a plain story. Mount Rushmore peaked at roughly 3 million visitors a year in the early 2000s. By 2024, it was down to 1.85 million. That's a decline of nearly 40% from the peak, and the trajectory hasn't stabilized. The spending numbers are more complex. Visitor expenditures in the surrounding area actually surged after the pandemic, peaking at $389 million in 2023 before dropping to $304 million in 2024. But that reflects inflation and higher hotel rates more than it reflects enthusiasm. Meanwhile, the monument itself has become a recurring stage for political battles that have nothing to do with Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, or Roosevelt. In 2009, the National Park Service banned fireworks at the site, citing wildfire risk in a Black Hills forest devastated by pine beetle infestations that had left thousands of acres of dead, highly flammable timber. In 2020, President Trump overrode the ban and held a large 4th of July event at the memorial. 7,500 people, no social distancing, no masks required, during which he delivered a politically charged speech criticizing the movement to remove Confederate monuments elsewhere in the country. Native American protesters blockaded the road leading to the memorial. There were arrests. Charges were later dropped. Fireworks were banned again under the Biden administration. In 2026, Trump brought them back again, this time for the nation's 250th anniversary. Each cycle generates news coverage that has very little to do with the artistry of Gutzon Borglum, and very much to do with the ongoing argument over what America means and who gets to define it. At the same time, the National Park Service, the agency charged with caring for the memorial, has been hollowed out. Since early 2025, the NPS has lost roughly a quarter of its permanent workforce nationwide, about 4,000 employees through layoffs, buyouts, and resignations. Proposed budget cuts for 2027 would slash operating funds by more than 25% and reduce construction budgets by 72%. At Mount Rushmore specifically, the effects are difficult to quantify from the outside. But across the national park system, visitor centers have reduced hours, ranger-led programs have been curtailed, and entrance fees at some parks have gone uncollected because there simply aren't enough staff to man the gates. The deferred maintenance backlog for the entire national park system now exceeds $24 billion. None of this makes for a compelling sales pitch, and it's worth remembering that Doane Robinson's original pitch, the entire reason this mountain was carved, was a sales pitch. It was always about selling something, a state, a story, a version of America that would make people drive across the plains and spend money in places like Keystone. The product for 80 years was patriotism made tangible. But what happens when the sales pitch gets complicated? Drive 8 hours across the prairie, pay $10 to a private company to park, walk past the gift shops, stand a quarter mile from 4 faces you've seen 1,000 times. Learn from the interpretive signs, from your phone, from the conversation you had with your daughter the night before, that the mountain was taken from people who still refuse to accept payment for it. Drive home. And yet it would be dishonest to end the story there, because something else is also true. The granite of the Black Hills is among the hardest and most durable stone on the continent. Geologists estimate that it erodes at a rate of roughly 1 inch every 10,000 years. Barring an earthquake or a deliberate demolition, the 4 faces on Mount Rushmore will outlast every building in America. They will outlast the parking garage and the food court and the avenue of flags. They will outlast the arguments about them. They will outlast the country that carved them, in all probability, by tens of thousands of years. The Lakota knew this about the rock. That's why they held it sacred. It was the one thing that didn't change. In 1998, 57 years after Gutzon Borglum died with his Hall of Records unfinished, workers returned to the canyon behind the 4 heads and installed a titanium vault in the granite floor of the abandoned chamber. Inside the vault, they placed 16 porcelain enamel panels containing the texts of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and a brief history of the memorial. Then they sealed the vault and walked away. The Hall of Records is not open to the public. No trail leads to it. Most visitors don't know it exists. Somewhere behind Abraham Lincoln's head, in a room that was never completed, in a mountain that was never supposed to be carved, the founding documents of a nation rest inside a capsule designed to last for thousands of years. The mountain around them will hold. The faces above them will endure. Whether anyone will come to look at them is a question the granite doesn't answer.